You think you know what strength looks like? Loud voices, big gestures, medals on a chest? That's what they taught me too. They were wrong. My story isn't about glory or revenge, it's about silence, about the kind of fight no one sees coming until it's too late. I was the daughter no one believed in, the soldier they didn't want, the ghost they couldn't stop talking about. If you want to know how a quiet girl became a name that made men stop laughing, stay with me. And if this story makes you feel something, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what strength means to you. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, born and raised in Texas, in a house where duty wasn't just expected, it was inherited, like the color of your eyes or the shape of your hands. In my family, the uniform wasn't clothing. It was a second skin. My earliest memories smell like gun oil and leather polish. My father used to say there were only two types of people in this world: those who serve, and those who fail, the ones who do. He never wondered which one I'd be. He already decided. I was the youngest of three, and the only girl. My brothers were born for the battlefield, at least in my father's eyes. Strong, loud, fearless, heroes in training. I was different, quiet, too curious about the things that didn't fit in his rigid world. He thought silence meant weakness. He was wrong, but back then I didn't know that. He had a way of looking at me that made me feel smaller than I was, like every dream I had was a waste of his oxygen. He didn't say it outright, not always, but the message was clear. You're not cut out for this. Leave the war to the men, and when he did speak, his words were heavy, sharp, designed to slice me down to size. You'll never last a day out there, he said once, while his medals caught the sunlight like knives. You're not built for it. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just memorized the sound of his voice when he said those words. Because deep down, I knew one day I'd make him eat them, not with shouting, not with rage, but with silence. The kind that comes after the impossible becomes real. But that day was still years away. The truth? I didn't join the army to spite him. People like to believe stories of rebellion, of daughters who fight back out of anger. That wasn't me. My reason was simpler. Stranger. I joined because when I pictured my life any other way, it felt empty. Like standing in a room with no doors, no windows, no air. I wanted to matter in a way that couldn't be erased, and in my world, there was only one path that promised that: service. The recruiter didn't blink when I signed the papers. Maybe he thought I'd quit after basic, like so many others. Maybe he didn't care. Either way, the ink dried fast, and with it, the last piece of the girl my father thought he knew. The army didn't greet me with open arms. No one threw parades for Emily Carter. I was just another number in a sea of uniforms, except my number came with whispers. She won't last. Daddy's little experiment. Too soft. Too quiet. They didn't know that silence is where I live, where I learn, where I win. Those first months, I wasn't in combat. I was buried in supply depots, logging equipment, counting bullets like they were grains of sand. Some would have hated it. I didn't. The work taught me something no classroom ever did. The war isn't won by the ones you see on TV. It's won by the ones no one talks about. The ghosts who keep the machine running. But even then, I knew the rear wasn't where I belonged. I still remember the first time I held a sniper rifle. It wasn't on a battlefield. It was on a range that smelled of dust and burnt powder, under a sky so bright it hurt to look at. The weapon was heavy, cold, alive in its own way. The moment my cheek touched the stock, the world narrowed. All the noise, the laughter, the bets, the voices telling me what I couldn't do, fell away. There was only breath, heartbeat, crosshairs. That was the first time I thought, this is it. This is who I am. But back then, no one saw it. Not even me. And if I'd known what it would cost, the bruises, the broken skin, the nights so long you forget your own name, I might have walked away. But I didn't. And because of that, one day, years later, they'd call me something else. Not Emily. Not Carter. Something colder. Sharper. Ghost. The first time someone bet against me, I almost laughed. It was during training. Real training. Not paperwork and supply lists. We were in the mountains. The air thin enough to taste. The ground frozen hard as iron. There were 15 of us, all stripped to raw nerves after weeks of drills that broke men in half. We stood in formation while the instructor, Sergeant Mason, walked the line like a wolf picking his meal. He stopped in front of me. His shadow cut across the dirt like a blade. Carter, he said, like the name was a question he didn't want an answer to. You think you belong here? I didn't flinch. Yes, Sergeant. He smiled, not the kind of smile that meant approval, the kind that meant he'd just found his next challenge. Prove it, he said, and tossed a 50-pound rucksack at my feet. 7 miles, uphill. Clock starts now. They watched me run. Some cheered, most laughed. No one thought I'd finish. I could hear their voices cutting through the wind. She's too slow. She's too soft. She'll quit before mile 2. They didn't know what silence could do. By the 4th mile, my legs burned like fire. By the 6th, I wasn't sure if I was breathing or drowning in air. But something inside me, something I didn't even have a name for, kept me moving. When I crossed the line, the laughter died. Mason didn't smile this time. He just nodded once, like he was saying, maybe you won't break after all. That was the first time they saw me. Not as Carter. Not as a joke. As someone who wouldn't quit. But that was nothing compared to what came next. Sniper school isn't about shooting. Not really. It's about waiting. About drowning in stillness until the world forgets you exist. It's about understanding wind so well you can feel it in your bones. It's about knowing your own heartbeat better than your name. The first time they dropped me into the woods, it was cold enough to freeze thought. 2 days. No fire. No movement unless absolutely necessary. Become the dirt, they said, or you die. By the end of the first night, 3 people quit. By dawn, 2 more. Their footprints were still fresh in the frost when I crawled deeper into the trees, my rifle pressed against me like an extra limb. Hunger chewed at my stomach. Sleep tried to drag me under. But every time my eyelids closed, I saw my father's face. That look. That smirk. I stayed awake. On the 2nd day, they came for us. Not with real bullets, paint rounds. But out there, in that silence, even paint feels like death. I heard the first shot echo through the trees. A man cursed, then another, then quiet. They thought they'd catch me easy. They didn't. I lay there under a sheet of camouflage, watching breath fog into nothing, and when the target crossed my scope, I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel my hands. Just focus. The kind of focus where the world narrows to a single thread and you know, with absolute certainty, you'll cut it clean. The trigger broke like glass. The hit landed dead center. They never saw me. That day, a rumor started. The girl can shoot. But that wasn't enough. Not yet. Because being a sniper isn't about a single shot. It's about who you become when the silence starts talking back. And mine did. At night, when the wind scraped against the tents, I heard every doubt I'd ever swallowed. Every word my father threw like knives. Every voice that said, "You can't." I learned to answer with one word. Watch me. Months passed. Missions blurred. There are things I still can't talk about. The kind that leave scars no one sees. The kind that wake you at 3 in the morning, heart racing, hand reaching for a weapon that isn't there. But through it all, I kept moving, kept climbing, until the day they stopped calling me Carter and started calling me something else. Ghost. It had been 7 years since I last saw my father when I walked onto that range. 7 years since his voice was the soundtrack of my failures. 7 years since I swore I'd never need his approval and stop pretending I wanted it. But life has a way of circling back to the places you thought you'd left behind. The air smelled the same as it did when I was 18. Gunpowder, oil, and the faint tang of sweat on old wood. The same long benches, the same worn targets scarred by 1,000 rounds. Except this time, I wasn't the girl who used to sneak glances at the rifles lined up like soldiers on parade. I wasn't the kid everyone dismissed before the first shot was even fired. I was something else now. Something they whispered about in low voices in dusty tents and forward operating bases. A ghost in the system, the one who never missed. But to him, I was still just his daughter. The one who didn't belong. When I stepped onto the range, conversations died. Heads turned. They didn't recognize me at first. Not under the plain fatigues, the cap pulled low. To them, I was just another officer here for the qualification trials. But then I saw him. Colonel Richard Carter. The man who raised me. The man who taught me that silence was weakness, then used it as a weapon. His hair was grayer, his posture still perfect. Rigid as steel, like the years hadn't touched him. And when his eyes landed on me, they didn't flicker with recognition. Not even for a second. It was almost funny. He walked over, slow, deliberate, the way predators move when they're sure of the kill. His voice was the same as I remembered. Low, cutting. New recruit? He asked, his mouth curling at the edges. This should be entertaining. I didn't answer. Didn't give him my name. I didn't need to. He nodded toward the range. Targets are set. 7 stations. Try not to embarrass yourself. His men chuckled. Not cruelly, just the easy laughter of people who think they know the ending before the story starts. They didn't know they were standing in the middle of the plot twist. I picked up the rifle. It was heavier than I remembered, but it felt right in my hands, like an old secret. The metal was cold against my palm, the weight familiar, grounding. I walked past the first sector, past the second, past the 5th, straight to the 7th. The farthest, the hardest. The one no one touched unless they wanted to bleed pride all over the dirt. Someone whistled low. She's joking, right? I wasn't. I dropped to position. The earth smelled of dust and oil. The wind tugged at the brim of my cap like it wanted to test me, too. I let it talk, felt the weight of it in the grass, the shift in the trees. Adjusted. Breathed, and then the world went quiet. The first shot cracked the air like breaking glass. Dead center. The second followed. Then the third. Each one carving silence into the space where laughter used to be. By the time I fired the last round, no one was speaking. Not even him. I stood, laid the rifle down, and rolled up my sleeve. The ink on my forearm caught the sunlight. The mark only a handful of people in the world would recognize. A unit insignia that didn't officially exist. The kind that came with missions no one talked about and scars you couldn't show in daylight. And in that moment, they knew. Not just who I was, what I was. Ghost. My father didn't move, didn't blink. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes told the story. Shock. Confusion. Something else, too. Something I'd never seen there before. Respect. For a heartbeat, we stood like that. 2 statues in the middle of a firing range, with the sound of my shots still hanging in the air like smoke. But this wasn't about breaking his record. It wasn't about proving I could. That was the story everyone else saw. The real one was bigger. Because the reason I came back wasn't pride, it was truth. And the truth was poison, rotting the system from the inside out. Promotions sold like commodities, names disappearing off rosters when they didn't pay up, missions compromised because someone had bought a seat at the table. I'd spent years piecing it together, threading every rumor, every slip of paper, every whisper that smelled like blood and money, and at the center of it all was the man standing in front of me. My father. The hearing room smelled of polished wood and fear. Rows of uniforms sat stiff as statues, their decorations flashing under the harsh light like tiny, accusatory eyes. It was the kind of room where truth wasn't supposed to walk in unless someone paid for it. But I was already here, and I wasn't leaving without setting the record straight. My boots echoed against the marble floor as I stepped inside. Heads turned, whispers bloomed like smoke. They all knew the name now. Not Emily Carter. Not Carter. Ghost. The soldier they'd turned into a story, a shadow, a rumor with a sniper rifle and an unbroken record of kills. The kind of legend they used to terrify recruits into obedience. None of that mattered. Not here. On the other side of the room, my father sat behind the long, polished table reserved for the untouchable few. His ribbons and bars gleamed like teeth, but his face was pale. The same man who once filled every room with his voice now sat in silence. Maybe because he finally realized what I was carrying in the folder under my arm. Years of evidence. Emails. Signed orders. Bank transfers routed through names that didn't exist. Enough to burn down a career. Or a life. Enough to choke the system that fed on loyalty and called it honor. The chair at the center was waiting for me. I sat, placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly, letting the pages whisper louder than any accusation I could make. The general cleared his throat. "Captain Carter," he said, the title cutting the air like a blade. "Do you understand what you're doing?" I looked at him, then at my father. "I do," I said. My voice was calm, too calm, because rage wasn't my weapon. Silence was. I slid the first sheet across the table. "These signatures," I said, "approved deployments for soldiers who never passed their qualifications, certifications bought and sold." Another page. "This one authorized removals, names scrubbed from candidate lists, people who wouldn't play along." Every page was a nail in the coffin, and at the bottom of each, the same signature, his. The room was silent, except for the sound of his breath, the slow, ragged kind of breath you take when there's nowhere left to run. He didn't fight, didn't deny. He just looked at me, his eyes hollow but sharp, like he wanted to memorize my face one last time, and then, finally, he spoke. No. Just that. No excuses, no stories, no anger, no plea. A word heavy enough to carry everything he couldn't say out loud. That it was over, that he was guilty, that the daughter he tried to break had come back not for revenge, but for the truth. I don't remember leaving the room. I just remember the letter. It came 2 days later. Plain envelope. No rank. No crest. Just 3 lines in a hand that shook when it wrote, "I was wrong about you. You were stronger than I ever understood. I was afraid. Of you. Of losing control. Of what that said about me." I read it once. Then again. And then I folded it and put it away. Not as a trophy. Not as a weapon. But as proof that even the hardest steel can bend before it breaks. Years passed. The army changed its shadows, but the ghosts stayed the same. Some people think legends live forever. They don't. They fade. If you're lucky, they fade quietly. The last time I walked onto that range, it wasn't as a soldier. It wasn't as a killer. It was as something harder to become. A teacher. There were no medals on my chest, No name stitched to my uniform. Just a plain jacket and a voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. I watched the new recruits line up, their faces eager and scared in equal measure, and I remembered the girl who once stood where they stood, fighting for a place that didn't want her. I taught them what no manual could: how to breathe, how to wait, how to let silence become your weapon instead of your enemy, how to live in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Before I left, I walked to the 7th sector, the same place where I once broke the record that was supposed to break me. The grass was higher now, the earth softer under my boots. I laid my rifle down, not because I'd stopped loving it, but because it had given me everything it could. And I whispered, so softly the wind almost carried it away, "It's time." As I turned to go, the sun caught the metal one last time, and for a second it was like fire, a quiet fire that burned without sound, the way truths do. Because this was never about revenge. It was about dignity, about the kind of strength that doesn't roar, doesn't demand, doesn't need an audience, the kind that waits, endures, survives. Sometimes the loudest sound in the world is silence, when the one who never believed in you finally sees what you've become, and in that silence, I walked away.